Hey everyone, this is an extended scene from my sermon yesterday on the second beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, as well as on John 11 and the story of Jesus resurrecting Lazarus. If you haven't watched those yet, definitely recommend that you check them out before watching this video. Some of the things I'm going to say will assume you've already heard the message. And you can find that elsewhere on our YouTube channel. But now I wanted to share a little bit more about how Jesus and Christianity provide a way to approach pain and suffering that's radically different than any of the other major worldviews. And much of what I'm going to be outlining today comes from a book by Tim Keller. It's called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And so a large amount of credit goes to him for what I'll be talking about. But there are essentially four worldviews that I will be comparing with Christianity. The secular worldview, the SelfTranscendent worldview, the Fatalistic Worldview, and the Moralistic Worldview. So let's start with the secular worldview. This is more and more the air that we breathe in the United States and in Western cultures. In general, the secular worldview believes that the material universe, the physical universe, is all that there is. There's no spiritual, there is no God. And therefore, the highest value is our own pleasure, which each person must be free to determine for themselves. So there's nothing transcendent imposed upon them. We come up with meaning for ourselves. And so pleasure is one of the highest values, and then freedom also ends up being a core value because people must be free to pursue what will bring them pleasure. So the meaning and purpose of life in a secular worldview is freedom and pleasure. But that means that pain and suffering can have no meaningful role in life. They can only interrupt our freedom or interrupt our pursuit of pleasure. And that means that secular people are especially traumatized by pain and suffering. Their worldview provides no explanation for pain and suffering and no guidance for how to overcome it or what meaningful role pain and suffering can play in someone's life. This life is all there is, and there is no hope beyond it in the secular view, which means that pain and suffering often lead secular people to depression or anxiety or even suicide, because there's no philosophically consistent way to incorporate pain and suffering into the secular understanding of meaning. And so what can often happen when secular people experience pain and suffering is they start to incorporate values and approaches from other worldviews. They sort of adopt other worldviews and try to intermingle it with the secular view. Because pretty much every other worldview has better resources for approaching pain and suffering compared to the secular worldview. And so let's talk about some of those other worldviews. So first, there's the self-transcendent worldview. This would include views like Buddhism or Stoicism. And this view essentially says that pain and suffering are an illusion. We only suffer because we are too attached to things. We care too much. If we weren't so attached, if we didn't care, then we wouldn't experience so much pain and suffering when we lose what we're attached to. And so the solution is to detach from everything. Detach from everything you love, from everything you care about, and that way, when you lose something, you won't be so affected. It won't be painful to you, you won't suffer, because you didn't really care about it, didn't really love it. And that's the self-transcendent worldview. Now let's consider the fatalistic worldview. So in the fatalistic view, this would include views like Islam. This view says that pain and suffering are something that we're all destined for. It's just a part of life that we need to accept. We shouldn't avoid it. We should expect it as normal. And through expecting it, we can experience varying degrees of glory and honor based on how well we endure it, how well we are prepared for our pain and suffering. And so we shouldn't weep, we shouldn't cry. Instead, we should buckle down, we should bite our lips and push through, endure pain and suffering. People will talk about how well you endured suffering for generations to come. And that's the fatalistic worldview. Finally, let's consider the moralistic worldview. This would include views like karma. What goes around comes around. Those who do wrong will be punished, and those who do good will eventually reach eternal bliss. And so on the one hand, regarding pain and suffering in this life, if you endure it admirably, still doing good and living a good life despite your pain, you will be rewarded in the next life with less suffering and more joy. But on the other hand, if you're experiencing pain and suffering in this life, it must be because in your past life, you did something wrong or even evil. And therefore, there is no such thing as unjust suffering. If you are treated poorly or you suffer in this life, you can't complain. You must deserve it because of how you lived in a previous life. So that's the moralistic worldview. So how do Jesus and Christianity compare to these worldviews? Well, let's start with the secular worldview. Secularism has nearly nothing in common with Jesus and Christianity. About the only thing that we could praise about secularism is that it rightly identifies pain and suffering as, vaguely bad, and most people believe that we should do something about it. Of course, one of the major shortcomings of secularism is that you can't really tell other people what they should do. So statements like, we should seek to eliminate pain and suffering in the world sounds nice, and many might agree with you, but the worldview ultimately has no teeth to ensure that people do that. If my life is, pretty pleasurable and pain-free, why should I be under any obligation to do something about your pain and suffering? This world is all there is, and no one is ultimately going to judge me at the end of this life. There's no God. And so I'm just going to enjoy this life while it lasts. On the other hand, Christianity teaches that we should love our neighbor, working for their good and seeking to eliminate or diminish their pain and suffering, because that's what Christ has done for us. Now, what about the self-transcendent worldview? There is something that we can praise about the self-transcendent worldview. Often, we do care too much about some things. Often, we love things too much, or love things that we should not love at all. In Christianity, we call this idolatry. An idol is anything that you love or care about that either you shouldn't love or care about at all, or that you love or care about it more than you love or care about God. But the self-transcendent worldview goes too far when it says that all attachment, all cares, all loves are wrong or an illusion, and we should instead detach from all of them. Scripture clearly teaches that we should love God, we should love other people. And the Bible teaches that losses in this life are real. They're not an illusion. They are real losses, and mourning is legitimate. Jesus is attached enough, he cares enough, he loves enough to weep, and so we can too. Now, what about the fatalistic worldview? We can praise the fatalistic worldview for its proposal that we endure pain and suffering, and that to some degree, pain and suffering is unavoidable. Christianity would agree that there is some glory and honor that can come through perseverance. Romans 5, 3 through 5 says, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. But the fatalistic worldview too easily accepts pain and suffering. It doesn't see pain and suffering and death as foreign invaders into an originally good creation of God. Scripture teaches, however, that everything was very good in the garden that God created, and that though we live in a fallen world now, God will eventually heal and restore the creation so that there's no more pain and suffering. Death is an enemy, and it's an enemy to be defeated. It's not a reality that we simply shrug our shoulders at and accept. Finally, what about the moralistic worldview? We can praise the moralistic worldview partially because we do believe pain and suffering are a consequence of human rebellion. The Bible teaches that humanity fell when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, and that's what brought the curse upon creation. And the wisdom of Scripture also affirms that sometimes pain and suffering is a consequence of foolishness. But Christianity would reject karmic views, karma, the view that all suffering is deserved, which really is a cruel way to approach life. Scripture teaches that through the story of Job, suffering can be unjust. Job was described as blameless before God, and yet he still suffered immensely. He lost everything. And Jesus would be the ultimate example of someone perfect and without sin, yet who suffered unjustly, the righteous for the unrighteous. So I'll close with this. Christianity is radically different in its approach to pain and suffering because of everything I've said before, and because Jesus Christ himself suffered. He is well acquainted with pain. He loves, he mourns, and he sympathizes, all because he loves you. That concludes our extended scene. Thanks for watching.